And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose.
Listen, and I will tell you of a man named Robert, though his friends called him Bob. 74 winters had passed over his head, and like the trees that shed their leaves each autumn, he too had begun to feel the weight of seasons changing. Truly, I say to you, there was once great joy in his dwelling place. For 47 years he had walked alongside Martha, his beloved, and together they had raised children who filled their home with laughter. But as it is written, there is a time for every purpose under heaven, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. And the time had come when Martha was called home to her eternal rest. Behold, Bob found himself as a man walking through a valley of shadows. The house that once echoed with the voices of loved ones now held only silence. The bed where two had lain now held but one. And like Job of old, he began to question the meaning of his days. What profit is there, he asked himself, in all my labor under the sun? I worked 32 years providing security for families. I coached young boys in the ways of sport and fair play. I served in parent gatherings, seeking good things for children not my own. Yet now, what remains of all this toil?
Listen carefully to what I tell you. Bob's heart had grown heavy, not merely with the burden of loneliness, but with the greater weight of wondering if his life had been but vanity and striving after wind. For you see, as a man advances in years, his friends depart one by one, like guests leaving a wedding feast. Harold, his neighbor, had gone to a place for those who could no longer care for themselves. Betty, from the assembly, had broken her hip and was no longer the same. And then came a day when Bob went to see a physician about the condition of his heart. The young doctor, barely past his youth, looked upon images of Bob's heart and spoke words that struck fear into his soul. "Significant blockage," the physician said, as if speaking of a road that could no longer be traveled. I tell you truly, that night Bob lay upon his bed, but sleep fled from him like deer before hunters. The clock marked the hours, 2, then 3, then 4, and still he found no rest. Fear crept into his heart like a thief in the night, stealing away his peace. Not merely fear of death, but fear that his life, all his striving, all his love, all his years of faithful service might amount to nothing more than vapor that appears for a moment and then vanishes away. But hear this, for it is important. Just as I have told you that the wind blows where it wishes, and you hear its sound, but do not know where it comes from or where it goes, so it was that the Spirit began to work in Bob's heart in ways he did not yet understand. The weeks that followed were like those of a man wandering in a wilderness. Bob moved through his days as one walking in sleep. He heated food that had no taste. He watched moving images on a screen, but saw nothing. He took medicines from containers marked with the days of the week, but found no healing for the sickness of his soul.
Each Sabbath, Bob continued to attend the assembly where he and Martha had worshipped for 50 years. It was a place where the faithful gathered, led by Pastor Williams, a man of gentle spirit who reminded Bob of his own father. The people sang ancient songs of praise, but Bob's heart could not join in their melody. He sat among them like a branch that has been cut from the vine, present in body, but withered in spirit. After one such gathering, a woman approached Bob with kindness in her eyes, inquiring about his health. Bob gave the answer that people expected, "I am managing well, thank you for asking." But in his heart, he wondered if he was merely counting the days until he would join Martha in the place of the dead. Now I tell you a mystery. Sometimes the very thing we seek is hidden in the place we have looked 1,000 times before. So it was that Bob, while searching through old papers and documents, discovered something that had been waiting for him like a treasure buried in a field. There, among the records of his earthly affairs, lay Martha's Bible, the same book she had carried faithfully for over 40 years. Its pages were thin as the wings of a butterfly, marked with her careful writing, passages underlined with ink that had faded like morning dew. Bob opened the book, not seeking anything in particular, but as a man might cast a net into deep waters, hoping. The pages fell open to the Gospel of John, and there, as if written specifically for his eyes on this day, were these words: "For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life." These words fell upon Bob's heart like rain upon parched ground. How many times had he heard them? In his youth, when his grandmother taught him the Scriptures; at his wedding, when the preacher spoke of love that endures; at Christmas services, when the story of salvation was proclaimed. But now, sitting alone in the house where he had lived for 40 years, the words spoke to him as if he were hearing them for the first time. God so loved the world, not merely the young and strong, not only those with perfect families and successful careers, not just those who seem to have their lives well ordered. The world. This includes 74-year-old widowers whose hearts fail and whose medicine bottles line their kitchen counters like soldiers standing guard. Bob read the words again, slowly, as a man might examine precious stones to see their true value. That whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. Whoever. Not just the preachers and teachers, not only those who understood everything from the beginning, not merely the righteous who never stumbled. Whoever means whoever, even a tired old man who wondered if his life had any meaning. For the first time in many months, Bob felt something stir within his chest, not the pain of his failing heart, but something deeper, something that had been sleeping and was now awakening. It was the understanding that perhaps his story was not ending, but merely turning to a new chapter. He remembered Martha, how she would read this same book each morning with her coffee, how she seemed to carry a peace that the troubles of this world could not disturb. Even in her final days, when pain was her constant companion, she had said to him, "I am not afraid, Bobby. I know where I am going, and I know you will be there too when your time comes."
At the time, Bob had thought it was the medicine speaking, or perhaps the delusions that sometimes come to those who are dying. But now, reading her underlined words in her own book, he began to understand something profound. Martha had not been afraid because she believed these words with all her heart. She believed that God's love was greater than death, stronger than loneliness, more enduring than even the beautiful life they had built together. Bob closed his eyes, and for the first time since Martha's funeral, he prayed. Not the formal prayers he had learned in childhood, but the honest words of a man whose heart was breaking open. God, I do not know how much time remains to me. I do not know if I have been good enough, if my life has mattered as it should. But Martha believed in you with all her heart, and if this promise is true, if you really do love me, if there truly is something beyond this brief life, then I want to believe as well. The house did not tremble. No voice spoke from the clouds, but something shifted in Bob Henderson's heart that evening, like a stone being rolled away from the mouth of a tomb. The fear did not vanish completely, but it made room for something it had been crowding out. Hope began to grow, small at first, like a seed that has been planted in good soil. Truly I say to you, when a man's heart is changed, his eyes begin to see differently. Over the days that followed, Bob began to view his life not as a series of meaningless activities, but as a tapestry woven with threads of love and service. Those 32 years at the insurance company, he had been like a shepherd protecting flocks, helping families safeguard their homes and their futures against the storms that come to every life. The time spent coaching young boys in sports, he had been like a gardener, planting seeds of teamwork and perseverance, teaching them to rise again after falling. The evenings spent in parent meetings at school, he had been like a builder, working to create better foundations for children he would never know by name.
Perhaps his life had indeed mattered. Perhaps every act of kindness, every moment of service, every night he stayed awake caring for sick children was part of a great work that he had never fully understood. Bob began to reach out to his daughter, Jennifer, not merely to report his medical condition, but to ask about her dreams, her children's activities, her husband's work. Instead of expecting his family to come to him, he made the journey to Portland for the Feast of Thanksgiving, bringing with him not complaints about his ailments, but stories and laughter and the gift of his presence. He joined a group at his church where others like him, those who had lost their life companions, gathered to share coffee and stories. He discovered that his loneliness was not unique, that others understood the particular sorrow of sleeping in a bed meant for two. When the time came for the surgery on his heart, Bob faced it not with terror, but with the quiet confidence of a man who knows that his life is held in hands greater than those of any physician. If God's love was real, if that promise written in John's Gospel was true, then death was not the end of his story, but merely the doorway to the next chapter. The surgery went well, though Bob's recovery was slower than he wished. But like a tree that has weathered many storms and puts forth new growth in spring, he began to look forward rather than backward. He offered his time at the hospital where he had been treated, visiting others who faced their own seasons of fear and uncertainty. He shared Martha's Bible with anyone who needed to hear those words of eternal hope. Listen to this truth. Bob still missed Martha with an ache that sometimes took his breath away. But now, he missed her with anticipation rather than despair. He had come to believe, truly believe, that their love story was not finished, that God's love was greater than death, stronger than separation, more enduring than even the 47 beautiful years they had shared in this life. And so it was that at 75, Bob Henderson learned to live again, not because his circumstances had changed, but because he had finally understood what Martha had known all along, that God's love for him was not dependent on his success, his health, his usefulness, or even the number of days remaining to him on earth. It was a love that promised life beyond this life, hope beyond present hope, a future more glorious than anything his mind could imagine. Bob began to see that every person he encountered was also beloved by this same God. The young nurse who checked his blood pressure, the grocery clerk who always asked how he was doing, the mailman who made sure packages were safe from the weather. All of them were part of God's world that was so loved that heaven's greatest treasure had been given for their salvation. He started inviting neighbors for coffee, not to complain about the difficulties of aging, but to listen to their stories and share the hope he had discovered. When Harold visited from his assisted living facility, Bob no longer saw a man who had lost his independence, but a fellow traveler on the journey toward eternal life. Bob's